January 17, 1945. Fort Devens, Massachusetts. 14:32 hours. The winter sky hung low and grey over the compound, pressing down like a wool blanket soaked in melting snow. Steam rose from the mess hall kitchens in thick white clouds that dissolved into the bitter New England air. Inside the processing center, 23 German women stood in a line that seemed to stretch into eternity, their faces pale as parchment, their eyes fixed on nothing in particular. They wore the tattered remnants of Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, coats that no longer closed properly, boots held together with wire and hope. One woman, barely 20 years old, clutched a photograph so worn the faces had become ghosts of themselves. Another trembled, though whether from cold or fear no observer could say. The fluorescent lights above them hummed with an electric persistence that felt alien after months of candlelight and darkness. They could smell something they had not smelled in years. Something that made their stomachs contract with a pain sharper than hunger itself. Meat cooking on open grills, the sweet chemical promise of carbonated beverages, the yeast and warmth of fresh bread. One woman whispered a question in German, so quietly that the guard almost missed it. A question that would be repeated in different languages, in different camps, across an entire hemisphere of captured soldiers and shattered armies. Die RFENWR die Reshaping. Can we have the leftovers? The guard, a corporal from Ohio who had never left America before Pearl Harbor, and had never imagined he would one day be responsible for enemy prisoners on his own soil, paused with his clipboard halfway to his chest. He looked at the translator, a second-generation immigrant whose parents had fled Bavaria in 1923. The translator looked at the woman. Her eyes were not defiant. They were not pleading. They were simply asking a question about survival in the only way she knew how, in the language of scarcity that had defined her existence for longer than she could clearly remember. The corporal made a decision that had been made in dozens of camps, in hundreds of encounters, a decision so quintessentially American that it would become both weapon and welcome, propaganda and simple truth. He said something to the translator. The translator turned to the women. "You don't ask for leftovers here," he said in perfect German, his voice carrying a weight that made several women look up for the first time. "You get a meal, a full meal, and you can have as much as you want, this moment." Repeated in variations across 72 prisoner-of-war camps spread from Massachusetts to California, from Texas to Montana, would become one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of America's management of captured Axis personnel during the Second World War. It was not a designed strategy in the beginning, not a calculated program developed in the basement offices of the War Department. It was simply the collision of American abundance with European deprivation, the meeting of a nation that had never known real hunger with soldiers who had forgotten what fullness felt like. But its effects would prove more profound than 1,000 interrogations, more transformative than any re-education film or political lecture. Because food, in the end, is never just food. It is ideology made edible, philosophy you can taste, a political system you can swallow. The Second World War had been, among its many horrors, a war of logistics, a war of supply chains and industrial capacity, a war in which the side that could feed its soldiers and fuel its machines would ultimately dictate terms to the side that could not. By January 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt, though the killing would continue for months. Germany was starving. Not metaphorically, not in the rhetorical sense that politicians use when they speak of hungry nations, but literally, physically, desperately starving. The average daily caloric intake for a German civilian had dropped below 1,500 calories. In some cities, it had fallen below 1,000. The Wehrmacht, that once mighty machine that had ruled across Europe with such terrible efficiency, was fueled increasingly by methamphetamine, desperation, and the fading memory of better days. Horses were being eaten. Leather was being boiled for soup. Children no longer remembered the taste of chocolate. And adults spoke of butter the way one might speak of a deceased relative. With affection and loss and the understanding that resurrection was impossible, the women who arrived at Fort Devens that January afternoon had been captured in France, part of the administrative apparatus that had kept German occupation forces supplied and organized. They were not combat soldiers, though the distinction had become meaningless as the Reich crumbled. They had been secretaries, radio operators, logistics coordinators, the invisible workers of military bureaucracy. They had watched their rations shrink month by month, had learned to make soup from grass and coffee from acorns, had become experts in the art of not eating. The youngest among them, a girl named Marguerite who had lied about her age to join the Women's Auxiliary in 1943, had not seen a fresh egg in 18 months. The oldest, a 42-year-old widow from Dresden whose husband had died at Stalingrad, had forgotten what it felt like to be warm and full at the same time. They had expected, during the long ship voyage across the Atlantic, to be executed. When that seemed unlikely, they expected to be starved, worked to death, treated with the same casual cruelty that they had witnessed, if not participated in, across occupied Europe. They had heard stories, whispered in the holds of transport ships, about Soviet camps where German prisoners simply disappeared into the snow. They had heard about mines and labor details and mass graves. What they had not expected, what their entire experience of the war had not prepared them for, was to be fed. The mess hall at Fort Devens had been designed to feed American troops, which meant it had been designed to feed people who had grown up in a nation where abundance was assumed, where the question was never whether food existed but merely what kind you preferred. The serving line stretched the length of the building, a gleaming array of steel and steam and plenty. On this particular January day, the menu included pot roast with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans cooked with bacon, white bread with actual butter, apple pie, coffee with real sugar, and milk, whole milk, cold and white and impossibly rich. At the end of the line, almost as an afterthought, sat crates of Coca-Cola. That strange American beverage that tasted like carbonated medicine and liquid candy had somehow merged into something both familiar and alien. A drink that would become, perhaps more than any other single product, the liquid symbol of American capitalism. The women moved through the line in silence. Each received a metal tray divided into sections. Army cooks, young men who had trained for months to feed thousands of soldiers per day with military efficiency, loaded portions onto each tray with the casual generosity of people who had never considered that food might be scarce. A ladle of potatoes the size of a baseball, a slice of pot roast as thick as two fingers, beans piled high, bread to slices, butter already melting into the soft white center, pie, a wedge so large it seemed obscene. Marguerite watched her tray fill with something approaching panic. This was not prisoner food. This was not ration food. This was not even normal food by the standards of her memory, which reached back to a Germany that had been slowly starving since 1942. This was what she imagined wealthy people ate, what Americans in movies ate, what fantasy tasted like. She reached the end of the line where a soldier stood with the crates of Coca-Cola, bottles sweating with cold condensation despite the winter weather. He smiled at her, not with cruelty or superiority, but with the simple friendliness of a young man doing his job. He held out a bottle. She did not take it at first, did not understand that this too was part of the meal, that in America even prisoners drank beverages that in Germany had been luxuries reserved for party officials and the very rich. He pressed it into her hand. The glass was so cold it burned. She had not held anything that cold, that wastefully refrigerated, in years. The wooden tables in the mess hall could seat 300. The women sat together, clustered at one end, as far from the American guards as they could manage. They stared at their trays. Several began to cry silently, tears running down their cheeks without sound or expression, their faces frozen in something between gratitude and grief. The widow from Dresden picked up her fork, then put it down again, then picked it up once more. Her hands were shaking. She had forgotten, she realized, how to eat when food was plentiful. She had forgotten the rhythm of eating for satisfaction rather than bare survival. She cut a small piece of pot roast, the knife sliding through the meat with an ease that spoke of fat and proper cooking and resources spent without counting. She put it in her mouth. She closed her eyes. The human body, when starved for extended periods, begins to metabolize itself. It consumes muscle tissue, breaks down organs, sacrifices everything non-essential to keep the brain and heart functioning. The mind, meanwhile, adapts to scarcity by becoming obsessed with food, by devoting enormous cognitive resources to planning, imagining, and remembering meals. Psychologists studying famine have documented the phenomenon for decades. Starving people dream of food, hallucinate feasts, spend hours planning elaborate meals they will never cook. The women at Fort Devens had lived in this state for so long that abundance had become a kind of violence, a psychological assault that their minds could not properly process. The food in front of them was not just nutrition. It was evidence of a world they had been told did not exist, could not exist. A world where the American enemy was not starving, not suffering, not depleting itself in total war, but instead producing so much food that even prisoners ate like this. Private James Morrison, the guard from Ohio, watched the women eat with an expression that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had been 19 when he enlisted, 22 when he shipped to Europe, 23 when he found himself guarding German prisoners in Massachusetts instead of fighting Germans in France. He had expected to hate them, had prepared himself to see monsters, enemies, the faces that propaganda posters had taught him to recognize as evil. What he saw instead were starving women eating pot roast and weeping. Years later, in an oral history recorded for the Library of Congress in 1982, Morrison would say, "That was when I understood we had already won. Not because we had better weapons or more soldiers, though we did, but because we had so much that even our enemies ate better as our prisoners than they did as their own soldiers." How do you fight that? How do you maintain ideology in the face of a pot roast? The question was not rhetorical. It was the central psychological challenge facing every Axis prisoner who encountered American abundance. And it was a challenge that the United States military, almost by accident, had learned to weaponize. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 required that prisoners of war be fed rations equivalent to those of the capturing army's garrison troops. For most nations, this meant prisoners ate slightly worse than combat soldiers, but not drastically so. For the United States, it meant something entirely different. American garrison troops ate extraordinarily well by world standards, consuming an average of 4,000 calories per day with access to meat, dairy, fresh vegetables, and luxuries like coffee, sugar, and chocolate as standard issue. To feed prisoners the same rations was to demonstrate, 3 times a day, every day, the vast gulf in productive capacity between America and its enemies. The women at Fort Devens finished their first meal. Several had eaten everything on their trays, then sat in stunned silence, their bodies trying to process more food than they had consumed in days. Others had eaten half, carefully wrapping the rest in napkins with the instinctive hoarding behavior of the chronically malnourished. Marguerite had drunk her Coca-Cola in small, careful sips, trying to make it last, trying to understand the flavor, which was unlike anything she had tasted before, sweet and bitter and effervescent and somehow quintessentially foreign. She held the empty bottle like a talisman, running her thumb over the embossed glass, the English words she could not read, the design that would become recognizable in every corner of the globe. A lieutenant approached their table, an older man whose German was formal and precise. He explained that there would be 3 meals per day at these times, that seconds were available if they were still hungry, that the canteen sold additional items, including candy bars, cigarettes, and Coca-Cola, which they could purchase with scrip earned through voluntary work details. One woman, the former radio operator who had not spoken since her capture, raised her hand. The lieutenant nodded. She asked, in a voice hoarse from disuse, whether this was special food for their first day, whether tomorrow they would receive prisoner rations. The lieutenant looked confused. "This is prisoner rations," he said. "This is what you eat every day." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of worldviews crumbling, of ideologies confronting contradictions they could not explain away. They had been told for years that America was weak, decadent, exhausted by economic depression and racial strife and spiritual decline. They had been told that the Soviet Union was a primitive wasteland and Britain a fading empire, and that Germany alone possessed the will and strength for modern total war. They had been told that their hunger was shared by all nations, that their sacrifices were necessary and universal, that their enemies were suffering equally, if not more. The pot roast on their trays made liars of all those teachings. The Coca-Cola made liars of their leaders. The apple pie, still warm, its crust flaky and golden and impossibly wasteful of butter and sugar, made liars of every propaganda broadcast they had ever believed. This same scene, with minor variations, played out across the American prisoner of war system throughout 1944 and 1945. At Camp Hearn in Texas, German Afrikaner Corps veterans, men who had fought with Rommel and had expected to die with honor in the desert, found themselves picking cotton during the day and eating steak at night, watching American movies in a camp theater, purchasing ice cream from a canteen that was better stocked than most civilian stores in Berlin. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, Italian prisoners built a chapel with materials provided free of charge and received packages from the Red Cross so laden with chocolate and cigarettes that they began trading with local civilians, who were themselves subject to rationing. At Fort Lewis in Washington, Japanese American soldiers guarded Japanese prisoners, a psychological complexity that neither group had been prepared for. While both groups ate from the same kitchens, drank the same coffee, accessed the same abundance the United States Army had captured. By was end, approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners, the vast majority German, with substantial numbers of Italians and a much smaller number of Japanese. Housing and feeding this population cost the American taxpayer approximately $300 million, roughly $5 billion in contemporary currency. It was not cheap, but it was, in the cold calculus of total war, extraordinarily effective. Psychological warfare assessments conducted after the war concluded that the treatment of Axis prisoners in American camps was one of the most successful denazification programs ever implemented. More effective than lectures or films or forced viewings of concentration camp footage, because it attacked the foundation premise of fascist ideology, that liberal democracy was weak, that abundance was impossible without conquest, that the American experiment had failed. Marguerite spent 6 months at Fort Devens before being transferred to a larger camp in Pennsylvania. She worked in the camp laundry, earning scrip that she spent almost entirely on Coca-Cola, purchasing a bottle every day, drinking it slowly while sitting on a bench outside the barracks, watching American soldiers pass by on their way to training exercises or weekend passes. She began to associate the taste of Coca-Cola with safety, with fullness, with a world where questions about leftovers were absurd, because there was always more. She wrote letters home, carefully worded to pass censorship, in which she told her mother that she was well, that she was being treated fairly, that the food was adequate. She could not explain the truth, could not find words in German to describe what she was experiencing, because the German language had no vocabulary for this particular form of abundance, this casual, everyday, endless plenty that Americans seem to consider normal. In the psychology of captivity, food serves multiple functions beyond mere nutrition. It establishes power relationships. It creates obligations. It communicates values. When captors starve prisoners, they demonstrate dominance through deprivation, reinforcing the captive's powerlessness and the captor's control. When captors feed prisoners well, they demonstrate a different kind of power, the power of abundance, the ability to be generous without cost, to give without diminishing oneself. The American prisoner of war system, whether by design or happy accident, communicated this message with every meal. We have so much that we can afford to feed you better than your own country could. The German High Command was aware of the problem. Intelligence reports from repatriated prisoners and Red Cross inspectors described conditions in American camps that seemed, to German officials reading them in the ruins of Berlin, like fairy tales or enemy propaganda. Prisoners gaining weight. Prisoners with access to sports equipment and musical instruments. Prisoners eating meat daily. The reports were accurate, but they were also incomprehensible within the framework of total war as Germany understood it. How could a nation at war, fully mobilized, fighting on multiple fronts, still maintain such abundance in its homeland? The only explanation that made sense within Nazi ideology was that America must be exploiting its prisoners, forcing them to work in inhuman conditions, and using the food as a control mechanism. But prisoners who were repatriated in exchanges for wounded American POWs told a different story. They told of work details that were voluntary, that paid wages, that followed strict safety protocols. They told of guards who were bored teenagers from Iowa, not sadistic SS men. They told of boredom and homesickness and decent treatment and more food than they could eat. One prisoner, a former Wehrmacht lieutenant named Karl Fuchs, who had been captured in Italy in 1944 and spent 18 months at Camp Butner in North Carolina, wrote extensively about his experience after returning to Germany in 1946. His memoir, published in 1951, included this passage. I had been taught that Americans were mongrels, race-mixed and weak, incapable of true sacrifice or discipline. Then I became their prisoner and ate better than I had eaten in the Wehrmacht. I worked in their fields and earned enough in scrip to buy luxuries I had not seen since before the war. I watched them waste food, not from cruelty, but from abundance, scraping half-eaten portions into garbage bins that were fuller than our ration containers. I tried to maintain my hatred, my sense of superiority, my faith that Germany's cause was just. But how can you believe you are the master race when the mongrels are feeding you? This was the essential psychological break, the crack in the ideology through which reality flooded in. The Nazi worldview rested on the premise of racial hierarchy, on the belief that Germanic peoples were inherently superior, and therefore destined to rule lesser races. But superiority must be demonstrated through material success, through power, through the ability to provide for your people. When German soldiers sat in American camps, eating American food, wearing American-made clothes, reading American newspapers, watching American movies, the evidence of their own eyes contradicted everything they had been taught. It was possible to maintain ideological purity in the abstract, to insist on theoretical superiority while experiencing practical inferiority. But it required a level of cognitive dissonance that most human beings could not sustain indefinitely. The women at Fort Devens, like prisoners across the American camp system, began to experience what psychologists would later term identity disruption. They had understood themselves as members of a superior civilization, temporarily defeated by numerically superior but culturally inferior enemies. This understanding allowed them to maintain dignity in defeat, to see their captivity as a temporary condition that would be reversed when Germany recovered its strength. But the daily reality of camp life eroded this understanding. They were not being treated as inferiors. They were being treated better than they had been treated by their own government. The cognitive dissonance was profound. The hamburger became, alongside Coca-Cola, a symbol of this disruption. American soldiers ate hamburgers constantly, a food so cheap and common that it was considered barely worth mentioning. Fast food before the term existed, meat and bread combined in utilitarian efficiency. To German prisoners accustomed to meatless days and ersatz sausages made from sawdust and hope, the hamburger was a revelation. It was beef, actual beef, ground and grilled and served with cheese and vegetables and condiments, handed over with the casual disregard of people who had never questioned whether meat would be available. The abundance it represented was almost violent. At Camp Como in Mississippi, prisoners working on local farms were sometimes fed lunch by the farmers they worked for, and those lunches often included hamburgers, grilled outside, served with lemonade and potato chips, eaten while sitting in the shade of trees. The German prisoners, eating these hamburgers, sitting in American pastoral, began to understand that they had not just lost a war, they had lost an argument about how the world worked. Private Morrison continued his service at Fort Devens throughout 1945, watching groups of prisoners arrive and process and settle into camp routine. He saw the same transformation happen repeatedly. The initial fear, the shock of the first meal, the gradual relaxation as prisoners realized they would not be starved or beaten, the eventual comfort of routine. He became friendly with some of the prisoners, particularly those who spoke English and were willing to talk. He asked them questions about Germany, about why they had fought, about what they believed. Their answers, in the beginning, were defensive and ideological, but over time, over weeks of good meals and decent treatment and the grinding reality of defeat, the answers changed. They began to admit doubts. They began to criticize leaders they had once revered. They began to ask their own questions about America, about democracy, about how a nation could be so wealthy without conquest. One woman, a widow from Dresden, told Morrison in halting English that her husband had believed Hitler would make Germany great again, would restore the prosperity that had been lost after the First World War and the Great Depression. She had believed it too. They had been hungry, frightened by unemployment and inflation and political chaos. The Nazis had promised order and strength and national renewal. For a while, it had seemed to work. Then the war came. Then the hunger returned, worse than before. Then her husband died in Russia. Then she was captured. And now she was a prisoner eating pot roast in Massachusetts. And she could not reconcile the promise with the reality, could not understand how the system they had been told was collapsing had instead buried the system they had been told was eternal. The psychological impact of American abundance on Axis prisoners was noted and analyzed by military intelligence throughout the war. The Psychological Warfare Division of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force produced reports documenting how knowledge of conditions in American POW camps affected enemy morale. German soldiers, particularly in the final months of the war, increasingly viewed capture by Americans as preferable to continued fighting. Leaflets dropped over German lines advertised the treatment prisoners would receive, including specific details about food. 3 hot meals a day, as much as you can eat. Coffee with real sugar. Meat every day. German propaganda attempted to counter these messages by claiming they were lies, that prisoners were being worked to death in American mines and factories, But enough prisoners were eventually repatriated through Red Cross exchanges that the truth became impossible to suppress. German soldiers on the Western Front began to surrender in large numbers, particularly after the failure of the Ardennes offensive in early 1945, often asking specifically to be captured by Americans rather than Russians or British. The contrast with Soviet camps was stark. German prisoners in Soviet hands faced a mortality rate estimated at 35%, dying of starvation, disease, exposure, and summary execution. The Soviets, themselves devastated by German invasion and operating on the edge of famine, had neither the resources nor the inclination to feed German prisoners well. Nazi ideology prepared German soldiers for harsh treatment by Russians, whom they had been taught to see as subhuman and savage. The harsh treatment they received confirmed their expectations and did not disrupt their worldview, but American abundance did. It was the thing Nazi ideology could not explain, the contradiction that could not be rationalized away. By spring 1945, Marguerite had gained 14 pounds. Her hair, which had been thin and brittle from malnutrition, had begun to recover. Her periods, absent for 2 years, had returned. Her body was healing from the slow violence of starvation, rebuilding itself with American beef and potatoes and milk. She looked in the mirror in the camp washroom and saw a face she barely recognized. Fuller, younger, healthier. She felt a complex mixture of gratitude and shame, relief and anger. She was alive. She was well. She was eating better as a prisoner than she had eaten as a free citizen of the Reich. What did that mean about the Reich? What did that mean about freedom? The camp at Fort Devens held movie nights twice a week, showing American films to the prisoners. At first, the women attended reluctantly, expecting propaganda. What they saw instead were musicals, comedies, westerns, the ordinary output of Hollywood's studio system. The films were not about the war. They were about people falling in love, singing and dancing, solving crimes, riding horses across wide open landscapes. The abundance on screen was casual and assumed. Big houses, nice clothes, cars, restaurants, stores full of goods. The America in these films was not a nation at war. It was a nation on holiday. A nation that could fight the largest war in human history as a side project while still producing elaborate musical fantasies about sailors on leave in New York. The cognitive dissonance was extraordinary. Germany had mobilized every resource, conscripted children and grandmothers, melted church bells for ammunition, and still lost. America had produced movies and music and consumer goods and 500,000 airplanes and still won.
The symbolic power of Coca-Cola in this context cannot be overstated. It was a beverage that served no nutritional purpose, that existed purely for pleasure, that was manufactured and distributed and marketed with resources that Germany would have devoted to weapons production. It was frivolous, unnecessary, wasteful, and ubiquitous. Prisoners could buy it in camp canteens. Soldiers drank it constantly. It appeared in films and advertisements and seemed to follow American forces wherever they went. Bottling plants established in war zones. The familiar logo appearing in North Africa and Italy and France and the Pacific. It was capitalism distilled into liquid form. A product that existed because people wanted it, not because they needed it. Sold at a profit, marketed relentlessly. Successful because it tasted good and made people happy. To German prisoners raised on the Nazi economics of autarky and state control, Coca-Cola was both trivial and profound. A small thing that represented everything their system could not produce. In June 1945, the war in Europe ended. The women at Fort Devens listened to news of Germany's unconditional surrender. On a radio in the common room, sitting in silence as American announcers celebrated victory, they felt no joy, but also no surprise. They had known, eating their daily meals, watching American abundance, that Germany had lost not just battles but the capacity to fight battles. The question now was what would happen to them. Whether they would be sent home to a Germany that no longer existed as they remembered it. Whether there would be anything to go home to. The repatriation of German prisoners proceeded slowly throughout late 1945 and into 1946. Priority was given to prisoners who had skills needed for reconstruction, to those who were ill, to those with families. Marguerite was in none of these categories. She was young, healthy, and alone, her family scattered or dead. Her home city occupied by Soviet forces in the Eastern Zone. She waited at Fort Devens through the summer and into fall, working in the laundry, earning her scrip, buying her daily Coca-Cola, existing in a strange limbo of comfortable captivity. She began taking English classes offered by the Red Cross. She thought, vaguely, about what life might be like after repatriation, but she could not quite imagine it. She had spent her formative years at war, her adult life defined by conflict and hunger and fear. She did not know how to envision peace. In October 1945, she was transferred to a repatriation camp in New York, a transit point for prisoners waiting for ships to Europe. The food there was the same as at Fort Devens. The routine was similar, but the atmosphere was different, charged with anticipation and dread. The prisoners were going home, but home was a word that had lost its meaning. Germany was occupied, divided, destroyed. Cities were rubble. The economy had collapsed. Food, they heard, was scarce. The Allies were providing rations, but nothing like what prisoners had eaten in American camps. Several women asked officials whether they could stay in America, could work as domestic servants or farm laborers, could immigrate. The answer was always no. They were prisoners of war, not refugees. They would return to Germany. Marguerite boarded a Liberty ship in November 1945, one of 300 German women being repatriated in that convoy. The ship was crowded, but not uncomfortably so. The food adequate, if not generous. She stood on deck as the ship pulled away from New York, watching the skyline recede, the tall buildings and bright lights and overwhelming size of American prosperity disappearing into the distance. She held an empty Coca-Cola bottle that she had hidden in her bag, a small theft that no one had noticed or cared about. It was a souvenir of captivity, a piece of glass and memory and symbol. She would carry it with her for the rest of her life. The ship arrived in Bremen in early December 1945. The Germany Marguerite returned to was unrecognizable. The cities were destroyed, rubble landscapes punctuated by the shells of buildings. People were thin and gray and hollow-eyed, moving through the ruins with the mechanical persistence of the traumatized. Food was scarce. Coal was scarce. Hope was scarce. The occupation authorities distributed rations that were calculated at the edge of survival. Barely enough to prevent starvation, nowhere near enough for health or energy or recovery. Marguerite stood in line for hours to receive a week's worth of food. That would have been less than a single meal at Fort Devens. She thought about pot roast and mashed potatoes with something like grief, like mourning, like the loss of a loved one. She learned, slowly and painfully, how to be hungry again. She learned the tricks she had forgotten during 6 months of plenty. How to make soup from peels. How to stretch rations. How to ignore the constant gnawing in her belly. She also learned something else. Something that would shape the rest of her life and the lives of millions of Germans in her generation. She learned that the system she had been raised under, the ideology she had been taught, had failed comprehensively. It had not just lost a war. It had been revealed as fundamentally unable to provide for its people, unable to compete with the liberal democratic capitalism it had claimed was weak and doomed. She had eaten the evidence. She had tasted the proof. And she could not unknow what she now knew. This knowledge, shared by hundreds of thousands of repatriated prisoners, became one of the foundations of post-war German reconstruction. The men and women who returned from American camps became advocates for democracy, for market economics, for Western integration. They had seen firsthand what the alternative produced. They had lived, briefly, in abundance. They wanted to recreate it. The Marshall Plan, when it came in 1948, found receptive partners in Germany precisely because so many Germans had already been converted to American ideas by American meals. The economic miracle of the 1950s, the transformation of West Germany into a prosperous democracy, rested in part on the ideological groundwork laid in POW camps over thousands of meals, in the humble medium of pot roast and Coca-Cola. Karl Fuchs, the former Wehrmacht officer, wrote in his memoir, "We lost the war on the battlefield, but we lost the peace in the mess halls of American prison camps." That is where the old Germany died, not in Berlin's rubble, but in the realization that we had been lied to about everything that mattered. The Americans did not defeat us with their bombs, though those were terrible. They defeated us with their hamburgers. The women who asked about leftovers at Fort Devens had asked out of an instinct, born from years of scarcity, an assumption that there would never be enough, that the powerful ate first and the powerless survived on scraps. When they were told they could have full meals, as much as they wanted, they encountered a different assumption, an American assumption that abundance was normal, that there should be enough for everyone, that even prisoners deserved to eat well. This was not charity or kindness in the personal sense, though individual guards were often kind. It was structural, systemic, the logical output of an economy organized around production and consumption rather than conquest and control. The psychological transformation this produced was not universal. Some prisoners maintained their ideological commitments, returned to Germany as convinced Nazis, spent their lives trying to resurrect a dream that had been proven impossible. But most could not sustain that level of denial. Most returned changed. Converts not to American nationalism, but to a more fundamental principle, that systems should be judged by their ability to provide for their people, and that Germany's system had failed that test catastrophically. Private Morrison mustered out of the Army in January 1946 and returned to Ohio. He married his high school sweetheart, worked in a factory, raised 3 children, lived an ordinary American life. But he never forgot the women at Fort Devens, the way they had cried over pot roast, the way they had held the Coca-Cola bottles like treasures. In his oral history, recorded when he was 6-4 and dying of cancer, he said, "I didn't understand what I was part of at the time. I thought I was just guarding prisoners, serving food, doing my duty. But we were fighting a war with hamburgers, and we were winning. Every meal was a victory. Every prisoner who gained weight was a defeat for Hitler. We fed them into democracy, one plate at a time." Marguerite lived in Bremen for 3 years after repatriation, working in a textile factory, surviving on rations and hope. In 1948, the Marshall Plan began its work, and slowly, gradually, food became more available. In 1949, she tasted Coca-Cola again for the first time since her repatriation. Purchased from a small shop that had just begun importing American goods, she stood on the street, drinking it slowly, crying, remembering Fort Devens and warmth and safety and 3 meals per day. In 1951, she emigrated to the United States, sponsored by a church group in Pennsylvania. She worked as a seamstress, married a veteran, had 2 daughters. She told them, when they were old enough to understand, about the war and the hunger and the camp and the question about leftovers. That had changed her understanding of the world. She told them that democracy tasted like Coca-Cola and pot roast, and that tyranny tasted like grass soup and ersatz coffee, and that the difference was not metaphorical, but literal, measurable in pounds and calories and the simple ability to be full.
The Coca-Cola bottle she had stolen from the repatriation camp, that small piece of glass with the embossed logo, sat on a shelf in her American home for 42 years. When she died in 1997, her daughters kept it, and one of them keeps it still, a strange inheritance, a relic of transformation. It is empty and dusty and unremarkable, just an old glass bottle. But it carries within its curve and weight and faded lettering the story of how a war was won, not just with guns but with groceries. How an ideology was defeated, not just with arguments, but with abundance. How a question about leftovers received an answer that echoed across decades and continents and generations. The lesson, if there is one, is not that America was morally superior because it had more food. Abundance is not virtue, and hunger is not sin. The lesson is about systems, about what different ways of organizing human society can produce. Fascism promised national glory through conquest. Socialism promised equality through control. And liberal democratic capitalism promised prosperity through freedom and competition. The proof, in the end, was not in the promises but in the plates, not in the rhetoric but in the rations, not in what leaders said but in what people ate. The women at Fort Devens, like prisoners in camps across America, ate better under captivity by their enemies than under freedom in their homeland. That single fact, repeated in hundreds of thousands of meals, witnessed by hundreds of thousands of prisoners, reported in letters and conversations and memories, did more to delegitimize fascist ideology than any political argument or philosophical debate. You cannot maintain that you are the master race when the people you called inferior are feeding you. You cannot insist that your system is superior when their system feeds even its prisoners better than your system fed its citizens. You cannot keep faith with leaders who starved you when their enemies made you full. This is the story of how wars are won and lost, not just on battlefields but in mess halls, not just with weapons but with wealth, not just through force but through the simple, devastating power of enough. The women who asked about leftovers learned there were no leftovers in America because there was always more, always another serving, always abundance where they had been taught only scarcity could exist. They learned it through pot roast and hamburgers, through Coca-Cola and apple pie, through the daily material evidence that their worldview had been built on lies. And in learning this, in gaining weight and health and understanding in the camps of their captors, They became the first wave of a new Germany, a generation that would reject the old paths and embrace the systems that had fed them when their own leaders could not. The question about leftovers had been answered, not with words but with meals, not with promises but with plates piled high. The answer echoed forward into history, shaping nations and futures, and the simple understanding that freedom, in the end, must be able to feed its people, or it is not freedom at all.